The next subject I want to talk about is collaborations, artists working with others. In fact, now I'll go back to you, Michelle and Heleen, talk about how you collaborate together in Grimsdijk Farm.
Yeah, I think as Heleen said, we sort of met because of our love of digital craft. So we kind of put our knowledge together when we did a residency at Grimsdijk Farm. So with the materiality that I was exploring and Heleen's sort of MA work of the digital milling in the clay bodies, we wanted to make something that embraced sort of uncertainty and risk and failure. So something that we pre-engineer and we would mill. So we would digitally create something on a flat surface and then proper hybrid, you know, and then we would hand build it. And then within firing that porcelain body to a high porcelain temperature in the kiln, we would get this transformation. So when we opened the kiln, we didn't know really if something would be a super bad failure or if something was a happy accident. And so we wanted to embrace this way of making together. I mean, Heleen, what do you think about the collaboration? How?
Yeah, no, it was super fun. I mean, for me, it was very interesting. I guess because you're a potter and you have a very playful and intuitive way of shaping, while my brain as a designer is more. So I think it was a very nice hybrid in the sense that, yeah, I just could keep on producing small tests and then you would be the one that said, okay, now let's just like do it and let's get free and let's put on some music and let's make shapes. Because I can stay within this parametric way of thinking, and that's a bit where we kind of really match together, I think.
Great. Another collaboration both of you worked on along with Brett and Ryan is the Atlas of Lost Finds. So, Heleen, if you could actually explain a little bit more about what this organization is and what you're doing with them.
Yes, I can just I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, this is a very exciting opportunity that came up by Studio Unfold, which was mentioned already a couple of times by Jonathan. So they're the Belgium-based studio who kickstarted the 3D printing revolution. And it was launched in April, I think. And it's Atlas of Lost Finds is kind of an open call, which was launched on Wikifactory. And it was an open call to digital makers specifically. And it was about the fire that happened in Brazil in 2018. So basically the National Museum lost more than 20 million artifacts. But in the museum there was a digital lab and luckily they scanned quite a lot of the artifacts. So Unfold was in touch with the researchers over there and they came to them and said like, look, can you do something to tell our story of our country that basically lost all its heritage. So then the open call was shared. Unfold picked out one object, which is actually the Shimu vessel here. It's a Peruvian artifact from the 12th century. And then they gave the 3D scan data online, and the question to the makers is, please, can you reproduce this artifact, but also find the concept behind why you want to recreate this artifact, just starting from the 3D file. And then I basically contacted Fred, Michelle. We are in a group of 8 people. And I knew everybody in the network, but they didn't know each other. And we've been meeting up since lockdown, more or less once in 3 weeks, to give each other tutorials, but also to think about how to materialize the 3D scanned data. And now we kind of, we're based in 3 different countries. We're still in touch. And everybody has its own approach. So for example, here, Michelle is focusing on traditional smoke firing. And then also kind of really sharing her knowledge with the group. But then also, for example, from Belgium, I sent her some clay that I dug from my garden. So it really becomes a hybrid in production as well. And then from my part, I'm, for example, interested in molds. So this artifact was actually created using molds as one of the first semi-mass produced artifacts. So I'm kind of looking into how I can from the 3D scan itself, make a mold to reproduce more pieces. And then Fred also kickstarted from the UK, also being interested in hybrids, and he's collecting different 3D prints from the different countries to then kind of morph together. And Fred, you then also connected with Ryan, who also helped you with the 3D printing. So I think it's a very interesting project in terms of networking that is really kind of spreading out. So we just 8 participants, but in total there are more. I think there are now 40 participants all over the world, coming from Australia, China, Taiwan. It's very exciting, and soon we all will be put in touch, and the collection will kind of come together.
Thanks. Talking the other day with Michelle when we were unpacking, setting this up, she talked about an idea she had, the notion of uncertainty, risk and failure, can it be embraced? Michelle, if you could start discussing that, and everyone else, I'm sure uncertainty is a big part of your practice.
Yeah, especially with the work I'm showing here for the weekend, very much about the clay bodies that change once they're fired to high temperatures. So there's a certain amount of control. I think after the residency of Grimsdyke Farm, you know, the 2 whole weeks concentrated period was really getting to grips with the materiality, pushing the parameters, knowing how far you can go, and develop a technique. But I wanted to ask, say, Fred, how do you embrace this notion within printing? Do you hate this idea that you can't control things once they go in the kiln? You very much feel like you want to be in control, or do you want to leave things to happy accidents and see how things can warp or change in the firing process?
It's like, it's more a case of, do you have a choice in the matter? Failure is kind of guaranteed, isn't it? At so many different levels when you're printing with clay. And then the question is, how do you adapt to it? Like, do you incorporate the failure into the development of your ideas, or do you try and take measures to kind of rectify? It's on the nature of the failure, isn't it? Sometimes a fail can work entirely in the right direction. It somehow feels quite apt to the end result which you're aiming for. But then other times it's quite glaringly obvious as just a fail, at which point you need to kind of intervene and, yeah, basically focus on things which you can change. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of enjoy the element of failure, and it can fail at so many different stages in the actual design process, the printing, the glazing. It's part of the craft, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and also, Nico, you discussed at the beginning about how when you were starting with 3D printing, actually, that was driving your practice. Actually, how you described that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think, you know, like, I think we've all experienced it, you know, like we're printing something that we consider as perfect, right? Or like according to sort of the printing standards. And we go to the bathroom to get a drink, and it goes completely crazy, you know? And it was, it was then, you know, like when I realized, okay, maybe, you know, like I should let it be a bit more crazy, you know? Like, I think when it comes to sort of failure, like in my case, I push it to ultimate failure, you know? So it's like, I try to make it as fail as much as possible, you know? Like, and to do this, I see people who print very well first, and I say, okay, then what wouldn't they want, you know? So maybe I have a shaking table, or I print with like a nozzle that's not very straight, and it's, you know, like, and things like this, you know, I try to brainstorm a lot, and that's how I utilize sort of failure into making my work.
One thing about failure, is it easy to repeat? Yeah, you've made a mistake and it's great, and this is not what you wanted, but it's amazing. But is it easy to repeat this process?
Preston's lovely pointing at me. Yeah, I think it's really hard to really create a sort of mistake, you know, especially some of the beautiful, intricate ones.
But say it's something you wanted to, like, oh, I like that. How can I do that?
To a certain level. I mean, if you move a piece as it's printing, you know, you're going to kind of get a certain kind of thing happen, but you can't really create what the form is when the machine's doing it. But I think what's so cool about it is that the machine doesn't know it's messed up, you know. And when we talk about messed up and fails, we mean pieces that are not printed layer by layer perfectly in a line. and they are beautiful. And I think that's, you know, there's boundaries to push, and I think, you know, we are all explore and see those fails, and then it gives us an idea. Light bulb goes off on the head. What if I do this? What if I tweak that? And it's all about tweaking and pushing. But to answer your question, no, you can't really recreate.
Exactly.
Unless you can diagnose the cause of the fail, which is sometimes the hard part, isn't it?
Exactly.
And
Heleen, you work with the expanding clay. Do you find, well, experimentation is the element of surprise in your work. How do you embrace it?
Yeah, I try to kind of control the mistake, and to really kind of, yeah, if I try something and then the outcome is different, then for me the challenge is to find the vocabulary, the stages in between the big mistake and the perfect thing you want. And then I'm interested in like how can that become a new vocabulary. So I'm really thinking in a parametric way, and I try to recreate. Yeah. It's very complex, not being a ceramist sometimes.
Exactly. Well, Jonathan, you've had a long history of clay, and going from making throne work to slab constructed to 3D clay printed. What has been the element of surprise in your practice now?
Well, it's just kind of what one might be able to do with this. You know, the way I work is just fresh for myself, and you know, working with the code, I fiddle away with all the coding, and then it's got a play button, and I press the play button, and what's going to come out of there, I have no idea. So I you know, I'm surprising myself in that. And I was just listening to those points of kind of the happy accident and so on and so forth. For me, I think the actual printing part is more a means to an end. It's actually the generation of the forms in the software. And this is speaking totally personally. Possibly I need therapy about kind of being, loosening up a little bit. But you know, the delight and the surprise is in actually creating the forms, and then the kind of the machine just, I won't say just executes it. I mean, there's an incredible amount of skill and craft that goes into that. But it's the expression of the objects that I'm more interested in than necessarily the process.
And it never gets boring.
Yeah,
exactly. Great. Well, now I'd like to touch on some of the technical questions about in 3D clay printing. And one of the ones that seems to come up a lot, I notice, is layer and height. That's something I'd like to know more about.
I think I'm just going to talk about what layer height actually is, so there's no confusion. And layer height is basically the digital coils that are coming out of the 3D printer, and it's the height between each coil. So there's a lot of factors that come into play with 3D printing as a whole. So layer height being one, speed, flow, wall thickness, which we're going to talk about a lot in a minute. But there's a lot of variables, and I know Nico's work, he really pushes the boundaries of how far he can push his layer height and getting those sort of details. And also for mine, I'm quite compact, so I get these sort of really compressed coils. And basically it's a setting in Curator, which is the slicing program that we talked about earlier, of you can set these sort of parameters and then really tweak them to get really different results. And layer height can be affected in many ways. The speed of the print, how long it takes to print into a certain height, and also in the firing you can get delamination, which is where the coils pull apart because they're not compressed properly, and things like that. Anyone else want to talk about layer height?
Who else has a little layer and height issue?
Yeah, I'd like to add that, you know, like these sort of little variables is what makes our work unique from one another as well. You know, like even a little change, you know, like it will change the object completely. And we're talking, and we're usually comparing, you know, like how much pressure do you use, what's the speed, you know, and all of us working completely different variables. So, you know, like I think it would be interesting, like if all of us were given like the same object, you know, to see how we would like really print that, you know, because it will be different completely, I think.
One thing I want to talk about next is the speed of printing. Who would like to talk about that?
Sorry, Preston, looking at me. Early in lockdown, it was a case that I couldn't work creatively, and I thought there were a lot of questions I'd been asked during workshops And I thought, now's a good chance to run a lot of tests. So I did so. And they were about this kind of layer height to nozzle size and so on and so forth. And then also something like speed. You know, and to answer your question directly, I ran the same model with the same clay from very slow up to a very, very fast speed. And it didn't make a difference.
I was really surprised by that, to be honest.
Exactly. It really surprised me as well, because I have an optimum speed that in, you know, your settings, it says 30 millimeters a second. Now, what that really means, I don't know. But you know, and intuitively, if I slow down, it seems to work better, but then I'm always in a rush. So I'm trying to kind of push it. So I think, as Nico was saying, we all develop our own styles, and what works for you is what works. Sorry to put the plug in, but you know, all of that experimentation that I did, I have published. It's on my website, on the Instagram. You know, please, anyone who wants to follow up on this, I'm just trying to say that it is there, and there is an online community of ceramic 3D printing at something called, I made a note of this, I've forgotten, a Wiki Factory. So, you know, search out Wiki Factory, ceramic 3D printing, and I hope you've learned, you know, something this evening, but if you need more information, there is, you know, is
great. That's you're very generous with your time and your knowledge, as many people in this room can attest to.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
One thing I know I wanted to talk about was flow rate. Who would like to talk about flow rate first?
Everyone's getting shy.
It's one of the many variables, isn't it? And I think all of the things we've just spoken about, layer height, speed, flow, they're just one of, I haven't even counted them, but a lot of different variables that feed into getting a print to succeed, essentially. And one of the things I find simultaneously kind of frustrating, but also, you know, compelling, is that, you know, it just takes a slight tweak of one of these variables and radically alter the kind of success of it. So it's like when it comes to flow, for example, if you over extrude, then that will push out too much clay. That will in turn cause the layers to be too thick. Or if the flow is too low, then it's under extruding clay. Then it begins to spot. It doesn't actually form a proper layer. That will cause the print to fail. But it has to be in balance with all the other variables in order for it to work. Great.
One thing I want to mention is the next subject is biscuit firing versus a glaze. Some of your practice is definitely strictly a single fire with a biscuit. Then others use a glaze, which it makes it a different object after the second firing. Who'd like to talk about that first?
Well, mine and Helene's collection we made at Grimsdyke Farm. That was very much one high fire to 1300, which is a porcelain temperature. So that's really having no glaze at all. So actually within our materiality, it's half glaze body, clay body. So we kind of combined it together, which means it's a hybrid of sorts. So one firing high.
Yeah. Nico, you're definitely into the biscuit firing, no glaze.
Yeah, so I high fire my objects, one single fire to 1300 as well. And the reason is that I sort of want to maintain the detail, you know, like they're usually one color as well. And there's lots of sort of subtle details going on. And I've tried glazing it and those sort of get lost a bit, you know.
You kind of lose the detail in yours because they're so intricate, don't they?
Yeah, and because the wall is so thin, it doesn't really sort of absorb glaze as well. So it doesn't really work with my object. So I choose to just high fire the porcelain.
Now, Fred, you often glaze yours and you have a range of glazes and many types. How did you incorporate that into your 3D printing practice?
I mean, it was an interesting question when I started printing with clay, because I'd come from a throwing background, and a lot of throwing, you're trying to get the smoothest possible surface on what you're throwing, and so at first I was like, do I enjoy the texture of the print line? Is it an interesting thing to look at, or is it too obvious a sign of the process? I mean, obviously in time I've come to really appreciate that as something which is, you know, to be embraced, and it looks fantastic, and it can be explored in all sorts of different ways. But I mean, initially I was more intrigued, I think, like Jonathan, with just creating forms which are incredibly difficult to do by any other means. So more interested in kind of pursuing, you know, quite interesting biomorphic forms, and then exploring the surface secondary to that. And now I've got to the point where, even at the point of design, when I'm actually making these in the CAD software, I'm trying to anticipate the flow of glaze and actually incorporating that into the way I design the forms. But it's a really interesting question I'd love to hear sort of other people think of. Is like, what do they think about print lines? And did they ever at some point try and mask them? Did they use slip or glaze? Or it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's for sure. Just talking about my experiences, I think I print with porcelain, and it shrinks a lot, and it's getting the right glazes that shrink, you know, coincide with that. Otherwise you can get breakages and problems with the wrong glazes on the wrong clay bodies. I think a lot of my practice, I use no glaze and just use raw porcelain. I mix a lot of white and black to really show the sort of definition of a 3D printed piece. You know, I love, you know, sort of these real fine lines and layers within the work, and I don't want to cover them up with a glaze, but sometimes if you have a mistake, it's quite nice to cover up with some glaze as well. So I really strive for sort of a perfect print in my practice, and not try to glaze it.
Well, that kind of also goes back to something that's a little different. There's like, you know, you stain a lot of your clay, but is it sometimes more important the glaze, the color, the surface, or the form?
For me, I think obviously form is a huge element that comes into play, but I think again with just really showing off what the printer can do and those layers. I think, you know, this PC I'm looking at, you can't see it, but we'll put it on. Is you know, it shows that you can't make that by hand. It's impossible, you know. So I like kind of showing that off and what the machine is capable of in that sense.
And Jonathan, you much more use glaze in your practice, don't you?
I do, and a bit answer to Fred, that I think quite early on I was seeing a lot of pieces come out that had this very defined sort of layer to it, and I was getting a bit allergic to that. So I put slip on and I scraped over some quite simple shapes that were easier to do. And then I had to accept that the piece then lost something. So I've gone back to a situation where I use a very fine layer height, so that that texture doesn't shout at you, at a person. But then when you come in close, it's almost like a fingerprint that, you know, you get the shape of the hand, and then you come in and you can see those fine lines. So I hope I'm being honest to my process. I'm showing through all of that. But I don't necessarily want to scream out that, hey, this is a 3D printed thing. I want someone to stop. I hope, you know, sort of be taken by its aesthetic before they get sort of too hung up on the process.
Great. The next subject I'd like to ask about all of you, and whoever wants to start first, the limitations of clay printing. What are the limits with the use of CAD and your, you know, machinery?
Guess the big one is overhang, right?
Yeah.
Definitely overhang.
So to explain that, obviously when the angle of a print goes too far out or in, the clay which is built on then can't support it, so it will either collapse inwards or collapse outwards or in some other direction. And that is the big one, I think, because you really have to design your piece almost keeping in mind its structural weaknesses.
But does heat help with that? Like, I know a lot of people use, like, you know, interpretation of a blow dryer, hair blyer.
This is one of my very early areas, and I think a lot of people have the same thing. Take a heat gun to it, and that will just make it firmer, right? But at the same time, it shrinks the clay unevenly. So that in turn just causes it to collapse, or it causes a whole load of other problems.
Yeah.
But Brian, I think you've come up with quite a good solution on the printer that you've made to deal with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I made the same mistakes as Fred. You know, a hairdryer, heat gun on the side, and it's just uneven heat onto one side of the piece. It can just distort to left or right, or vice versa. I've got a couple of really, really delicate sort of blow heaters on my printer, so it's kind of a really soft, warm environment. And I think room environment is quite crucial. I think we actually did a demo up in Doddington Hall when we had the
Yep,
wasps
exactly.
there, and there was a little bit of wind
wind
outside, and then
Yeah.
you could see the print just sort of like not happy at all. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of limitations, and I think as artists we're always sort of striving to improve and improve and improve, whether it is, you know, the clay body or heat or environment and things like this.
Exactly. Heleen, what about the limitations for you in your practice?
I find I don't know, I had quite a lot of trouble with the Cura and travel lines because I'm using a compressor. It's constantly printing, and when the nozzle is traveling, then it always leaves a trace. And sometimes, yeah, Cura doesn't make too many sense. So then you really have to redraw all the pieces in a different way of thinking in one line. Yeah, so that has been my biggest issue. And it is really random sometimes. Yeah. I just have to try 10 times over and over. And
Else? Okay, we'll move on to the next subject, which about our last one. Let's talk about 3D clay printing and what are the future, what are trends, what do you see happening? And I mean, it's such an evolving craft in the last decade. Jonathan, what do you see the way of 3D clay printing going?
Sorry, Preston, I don't do futurology.
Future Shock was a bestseller back in the day.
In some ways, all I can always say is that, you know, kind of, I'm not sure that I'm going to be that. It's the younger generation coming through. I mean, I'm always intrigued to see, as a more digitally literate kind of whatever age group come through, is and it has become, it would be then second nature to them. I think my sort of generation, it's, hey, wow, when we were young, we couldn't do this, you know, and wow, this is amazing. Whereas a younger generation coming through, it's, hey, this is, you know, I take it for granted. I expect to be able to do this. So that fluency will be there much more. I think a kind of a mixing that it won't be so special. It'll be just part of, you know, one of the options that there are. We wait and see.
Okay.
I think what's really interesting working on the project with Fred and Heleen, the Atlas of Lost Finds and Studio Unfold, is that the museum that had a fire and lost thousands of objects, you know, if they hadn't have been 3D scanned just before that tragic event, we wouldn't have this sort of virtual link to the past and what's gone before. So I think, I mean, for me, the next step for me is to do a residency in a museum and work in North Devon in Bideford and work with harvest jugs, sort of 17th century harvest jugs, which were thrown, and they have amazing sgraffito and loads of energy to them, and I want to unpick that collection digitally. So for me, I think moving into museums or into objects where things belong in different countries and we can scan things and give them back to their countries of origin, or maybe there's a really interesting debate around that actually digital technology can help with collections for the future as well.
Nico, you're the youngest and we'll say the newest to 3D clay printing. What do you see things changing, or how the field go?
I think when you know, like when today I saw Jonathan's presentation, it was quite interesting to see how much this sort of new way of making evolved in 20 years, you know, from something very primitive to something completely, you know, like I think every few months we see like we talk about a problem and then they sort of fix it, and then we find another problem, and you know, like they also fix it. So it's so, like, it moves so quickly, you know. So I find it very exciting for the future, I would say. And it also keeps sort of this traditional way of traditional craft, you know, alive in a different way. As you know, like we've seen with Michelle and Heleen, they're contributing so much, you know, towards research through this new method of making, you know, that I find it to be so exciting.
Right. Anyone else have some thoughts on future of 3D printing?
I'm interested about the technology behind it, seeing how the actual devices kind of develop, and whether or not we're reaching a point where 3D printers, I mean, they're by no means reached the kind of their peak sophistication, but it certainly feels like, you know, they're kind of getting towards a point where, can they improve much more? What are going to be the improvements? Like, what are the next things which are going to actually change the way we can print?
Do you guys find it becoming much more accessible? Like in not that many years, someone could buy it and have it at home and just not even have any kind of ceramic or technical background, could buy a program, buy a machine, put the clay in and make things at home?
I think with clay it's a bit sort of more difficult than let's say plastic, because it sort of involves multiple processes, and then including like safety concerns as well. There is a kiln involved, which I think it will become more accessible. Like a few years ago, not many people had it in their own studio. Now there's all of us, and there's many more. But I think it will also remain towards certain professionals who will be using it.
Okay. Well, that's about time for everything. I've got only really time for one question. We've been running a long time. And this is what I found when I started organizing this August of last year. And even last year when Ryan came up to Doddington Hall for my summer ceramics, I made a demonstration with his machine, and Fred was there also. And there are people kind of like, that's not ceramics. They all had a pottery background. Obviously they work from the wheel, but there are a lot of haters out there. So anyone want to talk about the controversy of it's not really ceramics because you have a machine?
Who's been on the receiving end of the most haters, I guess, is the question.
And how do you respond to them?
You mentioned Wedgwood. He was such an innovator, and without technology, there would be no Wedgwood. So
Exactly.
we have to remember that ceramicists and potters have always been expanding and going into new technologies and fascinated by technology. Look at the kick wheel, the electric wheel, the Anagama wood-fired kiln to now the electric kiln where you press play and it's pre-programmed. So potters have always embraced new technology and will continue to.
Yeah.
And it's another tool like the electric wheel, I would say.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it at that, Michelle. And I just want to have a little conclusion now. I want to thank all my 6 artists for taking part in this 3D clay printing webinar and our 2 days of demonstration. I think it's been really informative, and I think a lot of knowledge has come out of this event. And I also want to thank Cedric Smith for organizing everything behind the scenes, including the catalog, of which I can never done it. I want to thank the Applebee's, whose beautiful Victorian artist studio we get to use for 2 days for our show. It's just been amazing things. So thank you, Alex and Rob. I want to thank Peter Bridgman, who could not have been any more resourceful and helpful in organizing this Zoom webinar. We totally owe you a debt of thanks. And lastly, I want to thank the team at London Craft Week who made this whole event possible. Philippa Hobson, who asked me August of last year, do you have an idea, Preston, for something to do for London Craft Week? I said, yeah, 3D clay printing, which I noticed had never been done. And so I want to thank her, Naomi Davenport at London Craft Week, Ria, who organized everything, and Francesca Andrews, who helped with organizing everything regarding this talk and the webinar. And if you're still interested in coming out, we're open tomorrow, Sunday, October 4th, 11 to 5 p.m. And I just want to thank everyone who joined us on the talk, and wish you a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Preston.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And that's a wrap.